share out my slides. Can everybody see that?
Yes. And maybe also you could introduce yourself real
Yeah.
quick for the folks who don't know you.
Yep. Well, a lot of folks probably don't know me. So my name is Patrick Schmitz. At this point, I work as a consultant, mostly on grants that are supporting the community of folks that do research computing and data or cyber infrastructure, depending upon your term of choice. I spent about a dozen years leading a research computing data program at a big West Coast university. And before that, was in a lot of little companies doing everything from multimedia to applied natural language processing and stuff. I have a background in computer science, linguistics, and art. And so I kind of bounced around a lot. But I ended up back at the university and got involved more in research computing and data, and then really loved the community broadly around the country. And that's how I ended up involved in some of these grants. And so I've been learning a little bit more about smaller schools, worked with some tribal colleges and universities over the past couple of years, and just been getting involved and listening in on the MSCC discussions. So I still am learning, and I'll appreciate your patience with me, and you can correct misconceptions that I may have given my background relative to yours. But the tools that I want to talk about today come from a workshop that we ran last year that is sort of adjacent to one of the main things that I'm involved in, which is something called the Research Computing and Data Capabilities Model. And that was basically a tool that allows folks to assess what they're doing with research computing and data on campus, and then contribute to a larger community data set that allows them to sort of benchmark relative to some of their peers. And what we were seeing was that a lot of folks, they would do that, but they didn't know how to take the next steps in terms of strategic planning and trying to sell their plan, what they wanted to do on campus. How do you actually convince your leadership that this is something important to do? Because many of us have more technical background. I did a lot of startups, and so kind of got forced into learning how to make pitches and things like that. And so I enjoyed sharing this, and it was really interesting what we got around as feedback and how many people found this fairly useful. So that's really what I want to talk about today. And just to sort of set the stage, most of you know some of this. So you know what a CI plan is, that it's often a component requested as part of different CI and cyber infrastructure related grants. They describe it as a plan within which the proposed CI improvements are conceived, designed, and implemented in the context of a coherent campus-wide strategy. So the way they describe it sounds pretty comprehensive, but typically it actually focuses almost entirely on networking and cybersecurity. It includes what you've got, what's in progress, and what you hope to do. And the goal seems to be, as near as I can tell, to ensure that your campus has a handle on these core CI issues, and where there are gaps, you've got a plan to address them. Usually I have to say something about sustainability and maybe an approach to campus-wide cybersecurity in the research and education infrastructure domain. And I'm sure that you have been introduced to some of the resources, or if you haven't, they're easy to get to at ESNet, that has these really nice resources around what is a CI plan and what a bunch of them are that you can get started with to actually work on them. So I put together this little table to distinguish a CI plan from the larger exercise of a research and education CI strategic plan. And while the CI plans are required for many NSF grants, they've got a narrower scope than the full strategic plan that you might consider at some point. They got a different scope and focus. As I mentioned, they've got different audiences, and they often have a different time horizon. So the full R&E CI strategic plan is a really useful tool, and I find it's partly useful to provide sort of an inspiring vision for both researchers and staff about where you could go with this stuff. But it's real work. And while the full strategic plan may seem like kind of a daunting task, the CI plan doesn't have to be a huge effort and is a really good place to start when you're beginning to put together both the vision for your campus, as well as the tools and information you need to start thinking about where you want to go with this stuff. Both of them do require some amount of assessment of the current state and the plans that are underway, as well as a bit of forward planning. Although, as I note here, in terms of the time horizon, the CI plan is usually a lot more near term than a strategic plan. The other thing is that both of them involve a certain amount of coalition building and a consideration of campus stakeholders, which is part of where we're going with this influence discussion today. So does that make sense in terms of the distinction between these two? You see if you're nodding heads, okay. So a reminder of who you're trying to convince with your CI plan. I mean, your mileage may vary, but this generally seems to be the general pattern that for CI planning, the audience is the proposal reviewers and your program officer. And for most CI-related solicitations, these folks will be strong on networking, either strong on security or at least moderately aware of security issues, and often not as interested or concerned about a lot of the other aspects, including research infrastructure, data support, and things like that. When you're putting together a coalition for this, the challenges are often around getting people to contribute and support to the effort and the result. So, you know, when you're thinking about this, you've got to involve different stakeholders. You've got to recognize their stakeholders' concerns so that you've actually got their cooperation and buy-in in developing this plan. And again, I'm sort of setting the stage for why this kind of understanding influence and how it works on campus is important. So to that end, I want to share some of the advice and tools and frameworks that I've learned about and the teams I've worked with have found useful for this kind of work. So in particular, the campus CI plan has to be a shared project, usually among these groups: central IT, research leadership, and then, depending on the context on campus, key IT providers. In some places, a College of Engineering may actually be heavily involved in networking, for example. And so it depends on your campus situation. So each day, you know, we are influenced and we influence others, although often we're not that intentional about it. We have to be more intentional when the folks that you're trying to influence are not people you know well, or if you don't have a lot of opportunities to engage with them. Maybe they're way up the tree from you, or they're off in another part of the organization, or you have to influence somebody in a position of authority or outside your organization. Now, in the book and movie The Princess Bride, we learned 4 easy steps to building our network. Here, you know, Inigo says, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father, prepare to die." So he uses a polite greeting. He mentions his name. He describes the relevant personal link, and he manages expectations for your relationship. So we probably want to tweak that a little bit on our campus. That was sort of the beta version. This is a tool that some of you may be familiar with. There's a group called MORE that does an IT leadership program, and they have the thing that they call the 4 I's. And this is really just a framework within which we think about how we build relationships towards influence. So the first one is, you know, initiate. Relationships begin with communication. And for communication to occur, someone has to take the initiative. So you walk over and introduce yourself, say something about why you're here, and then the conversation takes off. This takes practice. And so I encourage people, whenever you're in a group, new group, if you're at a conference, practice it. It's not easy, but as you practice, it gets easier. The next step is to inquire. Basically, you have to express a genuine interest in learning about the other person to make him or her the center of your attention in the conversation as you get to know each other. Then over time, you have to invest in that relationship. So once we've begun a relationship, we have to continue the conversation. Some people say that, you know, the relationship is the conversation. If you're not having a conversation, you don't actually have a relationship. And so keeping that up and keeping that going and making a habit of investing in those relationships. Once you go through those things, you get to the point where you can begin to influence people. It's not a solo activity. It involves influencing others to work together to achieve some goal that's important to all of you. And this is really the pinnacle of a relationship. The first 2 can be kind of hard for introverts and can take practice. That's me. I'm a natural introvert. I have learned to put myself out there, but it takes practice to get used to. The next 2 are a longer term investment, and they take building habits around. And so I found this a useful thing. Again, it's not rocket science, or it's not fundamentally new. It just gives you a framework within which to think about this. There's a series of other people that I came across that I found have some really interesting ideas about influence that I think are useful to just to review and go around. Amy Glass is an interesting person. She describes influence as a persuasive process, and she notes the word process. It doesn't, or only very rarely, happen all at once. It may involve building a long-lasting relationship, taking the time to understand perspectives, developing clarity about what you and they want. You need to take the time to get to know the people you encounter, paying attention to what they care about, consider the different points of view we encounter, and be very clear as to what you want. So influence is the result of this ongoing persuasive process. Most encounters we have are not once and done, and you have to make sure that encounters with others are positive so that the next time you engage with that individual group of individuals, they want to work with you. The next thing is that influence is a product of trust. The primary way to establish trust is to promise something and then deliver on that promise. This behavior on our part needs to be ongoing and also not a one-time thing. Next, we have to listen to what those you're trying to influence have to say. We really have to take the time to understand where they're coming from, what they're thinking and feeling. You have to ask good questions, and there's links in the resources that I'll share to what some of those kinds of questions can be. Asking insightful questions will help those that you're trying to influence feel that you value their points of view, that you're listening to them and really seeking to understand them. We need to learn to communicate persuasively. This includes talking about the current state, establishing the need to address the problem or to make a change. And once you understand the need, you have to develop a solution, and you need to visualize what the benefits will be. So, learning how to make those pitches, and a pitch that resonates with somebody from their perspective, is a lot of actually having influence as well. Finally, influence is all about solving problems. It's not about winning. If you're seen as a problem solver, your credibility will be improved and your circle of potential influence expanded. That last one's really important, right? If you're really worried about getting credit for things or being the one who appears to be out in front, you're likely to actually have less influence than if you're just interested in making stuff happen. Another one is Brent Gleeson. He's got a list of 7 things that are really important in terms of making progress. So identifying the results you want. You got to know those and work backwards from there. Illustrate your credibility. And this gets back to you have to show that you get stuff done so that people believe that you're worth working with. You need to invest the time necessary to get to know the people you need to influence, invite them to share their ideas. As he says, the team's voice must be heard in order to create a learning culture and continually improve overall performance. So this is, echoes some of what we heard from Amy as well. You need to investigate options that lead to common ground. And this one actually is really important. A lot of this is where partnerships happen, is where you actually explore how could we work together in a way that benefits both of us and actually sounds appealing to you and isn't just me asking you to do something for me. Intend an outcome that meets everyone's needs. This again is something about how you approach the problem. If you approach it in terms of I need something from someone, it's going to be less successful than as I want to work with you to figure out how we can help support each other to both be successful. And then finally, improvise is needed. No plan is going to survive first contact with the enemy, is the quote that he uses. Recognize that as you put together a plan for something, you're going to have to adapt, and you have to be ready to do that and be comfortable with doing that. So the last person I'll talk about or quote from is Marshall Goldsmith on influence. And this is from the Harvard Business Review, in effectively influencing decision makers. And these ones are really interesting, in my opinion. The first one is that every decision that impacts our lives will be made by the person who has the power to make that decision. Not the right person, not the smartest person, or the best person. And we have to make peace with that. And we have to learn to recognize who's actually going to make the decision and how do we get to them. When we're presenting ideas to decision makers, it's not their responsibility to buy the idea. We have to sell them on it. We have to start from the perspective of what do they care about and how do I make my case in the context of what they care about. We want to focus on the contribution to the larger good and the needs of the decision maker, not just the achievement of your objectives. And so a lot of times it's about connecting what you want to what the larger context is and what they're trying to achieve. And it's learning to put yourself in someone else's shoes so that you can tell a compelling story that makes them think, wow, this is important to me. I want to help you. And then present a realistic cost benefit analysis of your ideas. Don't just sell the benefits. You need to be honest and realistic so that they take you seriously. And then finally, focus on the future. And this one, depending upon your context, can be an issue, right? You may have had traditional rivalries or traditional challenges with some organizations on campus. To the extent that you can let go of that past and move ahead, you'll tend to make more progress on influence. So all this stuff is in the slides. Different things may resonate more with some of you than others, but I find a lot of these things are really helpful in terms of developing the mindset that's useful in entering into these kinds of activities and when you're trying to influence folks. So when we're thinking about influence and we're trying to be more intentional, one of the first things is, what is it you're actually trying to do? Okay, so is it you just need to get an introduction to somebody who's very powerful in a given context? Is it that you need direct approval or support for something you're trying to do? In the case of a CI plan, okay, who needs to be involved and who do you need to ensure is actually going to support it and that you won't have undermining what you're trying to do or bad-mouthing it to somebody else? And recognizing that there will be people who may not understand what you're trying to do and they may feel threatened by it. So some of it is recognizing that. You may just need access to information. It may be that you've got a group who runs something and you just need to find a way to actually get them to work with you enough so that you can get the knowledge you need or the documentation you need. For example, what is the current network configuration and how is it supported? How is security managed or something like that for your CI plan? The next thing is, what do they care about? So, and it's not always obvious from our perspective what another team or individual cares about. And so this may take a little bit of research or talking to people, right? What is it that motivates them? And how would you connect that to what you're trying to get done? Okay, so it may be in the case of somebody who you need documentation from to say, well, we're gonna help get more resources and help you do your job better. We're really trying to help you advance what you're trying to do here. And then part of it is, who do they listen to and why? And this is a big thing about influence mapping, which I'll show you a little tool for in just a minute. It may be that you can't get directly to them. And so you have to understand, who do they answer to or who do they listen to, right? There's both sort of a supervisory model where you ask their boss to make them do something, or it may just be that that there's somebody that they think has really good ideas about things, and if you can convince them, you can get to the person in question. So sometimes it's recognizing your paths to the people you're trying to influence and understanding who do they listen to. So one of the things to that end is to map the existing and desired influence network. And that's really what we want to, I'll show you a little tool for today, but some of it is understanding, why do we want to do this? And then how do we go about it? And then the next step is, okay, given that we map and we understand what's going on our campus, then we describe the steps to get from where we are to where you want to be. And sometimes this is literally just, you build a little plan and you say, aha, okay, I don't know anybody. I don't know this person directly and I need them to support me. So I have to figure out who I know, who I can get to that person. And then I have to go about building that relationship and building the trust so that I can actually get what I need from these different people. Okay. And a lot of times this is going to, take a plan that you're going to have to change, right? Try one thing, it doesn't work, you try somebody else before you can actually get through to that person. And some of it is learning, right? You go and you learn and you try something and you find out, oh, that's not actually what they care about. Here, I thought this was what they were really motivated by, but then I found out from somebody else, no, what they really care about is this. And if you can figure out how to connect it to this, then you can get their ear. And so it's just that process of thinking about this framework and then executing on it on campus. So in the full workshop, what we would do here at this point is we'd run through some exercises for this. What I want to do today is give you a sense of what these tools are And if you think they're interesting, then you can either play with them, or we might possibly even talk some more about the details of running this. But basically, you go through an exercise where you list the players in terms of people or organizations who have power in some form related to your program. And you just list them all out. And the first thing is, do you actually know who those are? And that takes some reflection. You think about, the direct as well as some of the indirect folks who are powerful. And again, you want to sometimes distinguish the decision makers from the thought leaders, which isn't to say one is more important than the other. Some folks actually have the power to sign or block what you want to do. Other folks have the power to change people's minds, and they're both really important. And then we have people go through and annotate each of those, either as advocates, that they know about what you're doing and they believe in it and they can actually champion it. You're not sure, they may or may not know about it, but they're unlikely to cause you a lot of problems. Or then actual critics. There's somebody who always blocks or has a very different vision from you, and you've got to understand and recognize them. And again, the real decision maker may not be the obvious executive. So then the next step we typically do is sketch something. And this is an example, just a hypothetical example that I used. It's sort of an amalgam of different places that I was involved with, where I wrote down and I recognized, okay, we've got the president or the chancellor, depending on your structure. And here what I've done is I marked with a $sign the decision makers. And so there's a couple folks there, the president, the CIO, VPR, that have got $signs on there. I've got pluses attached to the advocates. So in this case, I was thinking about a research computing program. And so our deputy CIO and the CIO were big advocates. The VPR was. We had won over our associate vice provost for faculty, who understood that our program was useful for recruiting faculty. So I marked her as an advocate. And then we worked our way down to some of the other folks around campus that cared about what we were doing and what was going on, as well as you'll see there was a Professor X who I marked as a critic. This was somebody who only believed in cloud and didn't know why we were spending money on a campus cluster. And so, but I wanted to make sure that I knew about them and recognized the potential liability there. And then there was some that I wasn't sure about. They were either a question mark or they were neutral on this. So, you start off where you just list these people and annotate them. Then the next step was to consider the connections and the different kinds of connections between these people. One of the big ones is information flow, and that involves a direction. That is to say, who gets information from whom, who listens to the opinions of who, how do people find out about stuff, especially at that executive level. It may be their chief of staff, it may be a key faculty member, it may be a dean, but understanding who are they actually listening to is useful. And sometimes you just have to ask around to find out about that. That's part of the initial leveraging of influence, is who do I know that really knows how the CFO makes decisions? How do I find that out? And then who has budget authority and influence over whom? Again, that's, there are different things in terms of information and final say. And then how are your advocates connected to those in power? So the advocates for what you're trying to do, the true believers, the people who are willing to go out and speak on your behalf are one of your most powerful tools in this. And you have to think about then, okay, well, who do they know and how are they connected to those people? So then we go back to that map that we started building and we start annotating it with those directions. So for example, in this one, there's an arrow from the associate CIO for finance to the CIO, and that's annotated to indicate, this is a little hard to see on this, but I've annotated some of the arrows, and you can go a lot further, but basically up in the upper left, there's an arrow from the associate CIO for finance to the CIO, and the arrow is annotated with dollars, because that's basically, they have a big influence on budget decisions. And this is just a sketch, but this is an illustration of sort of how do you begin to map out and think about, okay, who are all the players and how are they connected? And who do I know that even indirectly allows me to get to who I need to get to? All right. And, in this example, we're thinking about it in terms of getting all the way to the senior leadership to have influence. But the same idea applies even if you've got somebody who's a technical lead somewhere and you really need their help and they keep saying they're too busy, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I get them to pay attention so that I can get the documentation that I need to complete my CI plan? Well, the same ideas are brought to bear in terms of who do they have to answer to, who do they listen to and respect, and who do you know that can make an argument for you in that chain. So having gone through an exercise like this, then one way that you can distill this is in a table like this. This is just one way to distill the work from the tool. And here what I've done, this is kind of an eye chart, but you can go through the slides and read it a little bit more easily. What I've done here is to say, from the perspective of a hypothetical CIO, and this is just one use case, and it's not reflecting any particular campus, just imagine the different roles that might be involved in thinking about both a CI plan and a full strategic plan. And then think about, okay, well, what do I have to do about that role? So if I had a CI lead, then they would clearly be critical and involve close engagement in building a CI plan. The networking lead is another one for a CI plan. And then I work my way down and think about the different folks, some of whom I want to solicit input from because I actually care about science drivers and things like that. Some of them are important to get review from because they actually have some involvement in this. We want to make sure we get their part right. There's others where we just need to make sure they're aware of it because we don't want to blindside them on everything. And so we annotate that, and that sort of feeds into kind of a communications plan we'll have around this to say, all right, I need to let them know this is going on, but I don't need a lot of time from them. And then there's others where you just, you need to make, know roughly that they know what's going on. For a CI strategic plan, you can see some of those are the same, and some of them you need quite a bit more engagement. And that's part of it is just to think about, okay, given the context, what do I have to do? It's also useful for each of those roles from the perspective of the person preparing this to think about what is your relationship, because that's going to influence it, right? If you're a close working partner, then you know how to work with them well. If they're just someone else on campus, but they are a key stakeholder, that's a different kind of approach you're going to have to them. And then you list in the influencers for each of those roles to give you an idea of, okay, how am I going to get to them, all right? Another variation on this might be from the perspective of a faculty member or a dean who's pushing on something where, again, same kinds of roles, but, they present a different perspective. And again, I don't expect you to internalize all this, but you can go through the slides and kind of look at it and see how, you might shift things for a given perspective. One of the things that's missing in these simple examples are some additional annotations that you might want to add to this as you refine it that indicate, within this, who are your critics or detractors. So you might color code all the green folks for the folks that are on board and any red flags that you're saying, okay, there's this faculty member and we got to watch them. Or there's somebody else here and we have to make sure that we're somehow engaging them and neutralizing any threats to the plan that we're pursuing. Okay, it can get really complicated. You can decide to go how far you need. A lot of it depends upon what you actually need and how much resistance you get to that. But the idea is to just think more carefully when we're approaching something like a CI plan, much less a strategic plan, who all needs to be involved to make sure you're not forgetting somebody important, because that can be really problematic, or to make sure you're not being overly simplistic about how you approach people and simply asking them for something without recognizing that's going to come about only as a result of having made some investment in a relationship and influence. So if you were going to take this and run with it at an institution, you might expand on some of this. So after you've listed the players and annotated them, you might think about why they are or aren't advocates, because this helps lead to, okay, well, how do I need to think about them? And how do I need to maybe shift their thinking a little bit? And then rank the strength of their influence or impact, because that's part of it. Is if you have a lot of people in that network, then at some point you say, well, I can't deal with all this. I can't chase all these people. So let me pick the 2 or 3 people that I think are most important. And so after listing all the people, you might say, okay, how do I rank them? And again, this is subjective, and you may need some help figuring that out, but you can always ask around on that. And then we talked about the connections and the different types of connections. So you go back to this point that I made. How are your advocates connected to those in power? And then one of the biggest things that arises a lot is, are there gaps? Are there key gaps between you and the influencers? If you find that, oh, the person that they really listen to, I need something from someone, the person they listen to is over here, and I don't know them at all. And that may lead you to go back and refine your network map a little bit and say, okay, I've got to do some more research and find out how to get to that influencer. And so you may have to iterate a little bit on the process depending upon what your situation is and what you conclude from trying to run through this exercise. And then obviously another big thing is that applies to almost all these kinds of efforts is, are there significant external forces? And this is probably more important when you're looking at a big strategic plan, but it can apply in any case of, is there something coming down the pike that's either a big budget issue or a big change in leadership, or maybe a big opportunity that comes along that you really have to take account of in all this. Figure out how to leverage that. People have often said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. That flip side of that is, great opportunity is something you want to be connected to. And then obviously with these things, it's a point in time snapshot. Now, you don't need to be revising this all the time, but if you were going to do a strategic plan around this stuff, you'd have to think about 2 years down the road, just reviewing it and saying, have the key players changed? How much have budget impacts shifted the landscape on campus? Or is there somebody who's won a big new grant, then we didn't even model that in the original map, and we've got to think about, okay, how do we recognize the importance of what they're doing in this? And it may also be that the campus has a big shift. The campus may decide to make a strategic shift, and you've got to reflect and recognize that. So, periodic update and review of these maps is a useful exercise, partly just because it's a discussion. It's something that you have with your team and your key partners to say, okay, how are we going to make stuff happen on campus? Who do we know? Who else do we need to influence? And how often do you want to revisit that? So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of the tool. I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. What I hope is that you've gotten a kind of a taste of what these kinds of things can do and what a more intentional and structured approach to thinking about these things can, how that can fit into what you're trying to do. So I'm curious, is this something that seems like it could be useful for your campuses? And in the slide deck, there's an extra set of links on this. So I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can have a discussion, but you can get to all this material linked through the notes. But the 2 questions that I am curious about is, does it seem like it'd be useful? Would it be difficult? And if so, why? And would you find it useful to talk over other people's maps? At the workshop, everybody started working on their own maps, and then they compared notes and looked at them and said, oh, I didn't even think about that. Or, oh, that's a really interesting way of looking at that. Or, oh, that's not how it is at all on our campus. And I'm curious whether that would be of interest to you. Again, as a community of practice, sharing some of your own insights among one another is sometimes helpful. And then are there other tools or support that you think would be particularly helpful in preparing a CI plan? So throwing out all those questions, I want to stop sharing so we can see each other and just talk.
And we'll stop recording.